Does the Indian Army adhere to human rights best practices? If so, what are the fundamental guidelines followed to achieve this? In the last video, I attempted to put human rights organizations under the scanner for the methodology they follow and the findings that they release in their reports. You can have a look at the previous video here. This time around, as I had indicated in the last video, I am going to briefly explain the best practices followed by the Indian Army to uphold the principles of human rights. Now, in all armies across the world, adherence to human rights is implemented across different spheres. This includes the doctrine that guides operations, the training that gets imparted to the troops, to the officer cadre, the rules of engagement that are followed during the conduct of operations, and finally, the legal framework employed to ensure compliance. Now, let me delve into these, even though, because of the paucity of time, I might only touch upon a few aspects of each. Let's first come to the doctrinal framework. Now, a doctrine is a set of principles or policies. These become the basis for actions undertaken, and in this case, we are of course talking of the army, though it's also relevant for all other organizations. While the sub-conventional doctrine of the Indian Army was released in 2006 in the open domain for the first time, internal guidelines on the conduct of counterinsurgency or counterterrorism operations were disseminated starting from 1955, when the first deployment took place in Nagaland. Now, this came not only from the Chief of Army Staff, as would normally be expected, but also from the Prime Minister of the country. Both clearly emphasized on the need to distinguish between the common people and the militants. Further, there was an attempt to bring misguided youth back into the national mainstream, which was a very important principle outlined at that time. Over the period of time, the following principles have become the basis for the operations of the Indian Army and the thought process behind all counterinsurgency operations in the country. 1. Violent movements need a political resolution. Military force is needed to bring down violence levels, which can in turn facilitate a negotiated settlement. And we've seen this in the past. Mizoram is an example. The second principle is of minimum force, which is the basis for the use of firepower. This implies that for any given situation, the bare minimum level of force must be applied. And again, I had referred to this in the previous video as well. The third principle, of course, is that the state distinguishes between foreign terrorists and the local youth who pick up arms, and similarly between terrorists and the local population of the affected areas. Now, what this ensures is that the local militants can be persuaded to return to the mainstream. And like I gave you an example of Mizoram, you actually had the leader becoming the Chief Minister of the state in 1986. And simultaneously, the local population can be shielded from the instability of an affected area. The next broad principle is of training. Now, the training curriculum at every level, commencing from the induction of a soldier into the army to courses that are conducted for junior, mid-level and senior officers, include human rights as an important subject. This is further reinforced through group discussions, training exercises, etc. Importantly, there is a system of pre-induction training for every soldier and every battalion which is inducted into a CI area, and this includes case studies which may be relevant for the local areas. The third broad principle is of rules of engagement. Now, the rules of engagements are guidelines which become the basis for the conduct of operations. Let me give you a couple of examples before I get into the details. All operations, for example, will have the presence of local policemen, or Policewomen will be incorporated for the search of any area where women are involved. Now, some of the other inclusions which I think are important and will give an idea about the respect for human rights is: 1. No unilateral search will take place. 2. Avoid large-scale operations or enforcing population control measures. 3. Operations only on concrete intelligence, which makes them very clean. Apprehended persons should be handed over to the local police within 24 hours, which is also as per the law of the land. There should be transparency in operations, both to the media and to the local police. Regular training and advisories on human rights, and this is a part of the rules of engagement for the Indian Army. All civilian casualties as a result of action of the Army to be given first aid. Very important point. Minimum collateral damage during the conduct of operations, and we have seen this in the conduct of a large number of operations in both J&K and the Northeast. Principle of minimum force, good faith, impartiality and necessity should be ensured. Now, in addition to these, further guidelines for tactical operations are also issued at the lower level to ensure that these principles are not only followed, these are also elaborated upon for the troops. Now, as an illustration, let us say, what are the orders for opening fire? It would be discussed in detail and implemented. The last major issue is legal framework. Now, the Army follows a multi-tiered framework to ensure strict adherence to human rights. At the first level, it decides whether to take over a case based upon the legally available option or not. Now, this is guided by the nature of offence and the circumstances under which it takes place. 2. The Army's disciplinary approach is guided by an offence either being an act of omission or commission, which implies, was it a genuine mistake during the conduct of operations, or it was a well thought out and a planned offence. The latter leads to exemplary punishment. As an illustration, under Northern Command alone, which includes the area of J&K where we know counter-terrorism operations are on, since 1990, 51 officers, 18 junior commissioned officers and 81 other ranks have been given punishment which ranges from cashiering to imprisonment even in civil jails, amongst various other punishments that have been given. Out of these, 52 Army personnel have been punished on the basis of suo motu action by the Army. Now, suo motu means that there was no complaint that had been received and the Army took action against the individual on its own. Important point, and it must be noted here. 3. All punishments awarded by the courts in the Army can be appealed against in the Armed Forces Tribunal and the Supreme Court. Now, this retains checks and balances within the judicial system of the Army. Now, it might come as a surprise to some of the viewers to know that according to a study of 2016, in approximately 25 years of conflict in J&K, 1121 allegations of human rights violations were received by the Army. Of these, the local police found it fit to file a first information report, an FIR that is, only in 350 cases. Now, this implies that the balance 68% were false and contrived. Further, of the 350 cases, prima facie evidence was found in 72 cases, leading to disciplinary action, as has already been mentioned earlier, and the figures therein. And finally, of the 150 police stations in the state, a mere 0.01% cases filed in total, that is, relate to allegations of human rights violations, to give you an idea and the myth that is propagated in the region. Let me conclude by saying that the Army realizes that human rights violations are against the very ethos that guides the institutional framework of this organization. Further, any laxity in this regard not only harms the interests of the country, it also adversely impacts the internal health of this 3-century-old institution. The Army's actions may not always be perfect. In fact, there are mistakes that happen, and the kind of punishments that have been given do indicate that. However, its endeavor remains the minimization of human rights violations of any kind in counterterrorism operations. Thank you for your time. Until next time.